Okay, so welcome everyone. This is a seminar on nuancing claims. So nuancing claims is a really important skill for debating because it allows you to be really specific when you're doing things like impacting your arguments. And it's also really important as well when you're trying to provide characterization for any given argument that you have, because you can always benefit from being very specific, very detailed with how you want to apply the arguments that you're necessarily making. This is very useful, especially as an extension speaker, because for example, when you're trying to differentiate from your front half, there's many strategies for that, and we'll do an extension seminar sometime. But if you want to extend on the fact that you have a more nuanced conception of the world than your front half, nuancing claims is oftentimes a very good way or a good strategy to employ that kind of extension strategy. So I'll go into the more of like those specifics maybe later on, but I want to talk about the general skill of how to nuance your claims first. So helping you guys ask the right questions to make these kinds of arguments is the most important thing. So this is what I call the rabbit hole of argumentation. And everyone knows what a rabbit hole is. And it's basically the same concept when you apply it to debate, right? When you're trying to really go down the rabbit hole of like who are affected by this, what types of people are affected by this, how they're affected, stuff like that. Those are all things that are really crucial to consider when you are debating any given round. So what is nuancing? Nuancing refers to the act of adding depth and adding complexity and adding a lot of necessary information to your argument. And it takes into consideration four broad things. Obviously, the specifics might differ from case to case, but these are the general four things that you want to consider. The first is consider stakeholders who are affected. Very simple, but it's not as simple as you might think. The second is how they're affected. The third is why they're affected. And the fourth is why does the world look like the way that it looks right now? You'll notice that these are very generalized questions. So to have them like be more applicable to your specific like situations, we'll go into more depth on these one by one. So the reason why nuancing is particularly important is because, and this is something that I've taught to you guys before at one point in time or another, is the axes of argumentation, right? Because as I've kind of like explained before, I like to consider arguments existing on an axis between how true they are and how important they are. And the best type of argument is one that fulfills both being very true and both being very, very important. So this is really important for this purpose of like nuancing of arguments is very important for the purpose of fulfilling those two criteria. Because one, nuancing allows you to characterize the world in very specific ways. It adds a lot of detail and adds a lot of depth to any given debate round. Because as you probably noticed, a lot of debaters tend to be very general in how they approach certain things. They say the feminist movement wants blah, 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 blah. This impact leads to, minorities being benefited, blah, 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 blah. But if you're able to characterize very specifically what types of minorities, what types of women are benefited from X policy, which factions of the feminist movement specifically can benefit from it and cannot benefit from it. Those are things that are important pieces of characterization that makes your arguments a lot stronger. And the reason why this is important is because characterization is the foundation of something being true, right? That's the first axis. Let me just time myself. Something being true, right? Because it operates on incentive structures, social, political, and economic conditions that exist in the status quo. So for example, one motion that I like to reference as an example is this House will disarm all police officers, right? That's a motion that exists. And let's say someone were to argue that this is a good thing. On Gov, we support disarming police officers because this stops police brutality. What do you guys think the issue is with that example of an argument? Where do you think their characterization is lacking to make that argument? This House will disarm all police officers, and someone on the government team says, this is a good thing. We support this because it'll stop police brutality. Any thoughts? You guys can put it in the chat as well.
It doesn't say how.
Okay, for sure. It doesn't say how, but in what way? Like, what do you mean by it doesn't say how? What does everyone else think? Why is the argument that this will stop police brutality is not going to be particularly useful in the motion this House will disarm police officers? Definition is not clearly defined. Sure, maybe you don't have a full conception of what police brutality is.
I think just understanding the context of why that occurs and the current world and why that is an issue and how that happens, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. So then why do you think then, as a follow-up question, why does that specifically does not, the policy of disarming them specifically doesn't really do anything? Oh, Nada says in chat, This doesn't explain how police brutality happens or how disarming will reduce police brutality. Yeah, 100%, right? And the reason why this argument is not good is because it doesn't really provide you an accurate characterization of the world, right? Because it assumes that police brutality is only done when officers are armed with firearms, for example. But that's clearly not true. Police brutality happens in a large variety of ways, whether that be through physical assault, whether that be through cough, kneeling on someone's neck. Those are all things that, are fundamental to the characterization about the way that police brutality and the relationship between police and marginalized communities in the United States, for example, necessarily require as important context to help you understand what the world is like. So if someone were to make an argument that disarming police officers stops police brutality, the reason why that is insufficient, insufficient, is because it doesn't take into account the nuances of the way that police brutality manifests. It doesn't explain why police brutality only exists insofar as police are armed, because that is not the vast majority of the instances in which police brutality actually meaningfully happens in the status quo, right? So the fundamental lesson from this is that if you can't paint the world in an accurate and nuanced and specific way, given how complex the world is, it'll be hard to believe that your claim is true. So therefore, that immediately makes it so that your truth axis is very, very low, right? So that's why nuancing is important for this part. As for the other axis, for characterizing why it's important, you have to understand the true nature of someone's struggles to really convey why it matters, right? Because, for example, the reason why nuancing in particular is something that's so important to characterize the importance of an argument is because let's say you want to say that X policy leads to marginalization of immigrant communities, right? That's a very standard line of argumentation you'll hear. And oftentimes many people, many of us included, would probably just stop at saying that's our impact. But notably, that doesn't do nearly enough to explain why the argument matters. Why do you guys think that is? Why do you guys think the argument of, why do you guys think the impact of X policy leads to marginalization of immigrants? Why do you think that argument is insufficient to prove the importance of itself in the round? Any thoughts? You can put in the chat as well if you'd like. X policy will lead to the marginalization of immigrant communities. Not a very important argument, but can you explain why? Yes, Ethan Curry.
It doesn't tell us how those people are marginalized or to what extent, or even which populations we're talking about. Immigrants represent a very large group of people from many different countries of many different socioeconomic and ethnic backgrounds. So simply to say this is bad for immigrants is a very imprecise argument that doesn't really tell me who is being affected and to what degree. Also, to say that they are marginalized is super unclear. People can be marginalized in a variety of different ways and to varyingly different extents, right? One policy may be not very marginalizing, other policies may be incredibly marginalizing, right? You need to be specific in detailing the manner in which they are marginalized and the scope and the extent to which they are marginalized as well.
Yeah, 100%. I don't think I need to add too much onto that. Yeah, you're very correct. Because the argument of like X policy leads to the marginalization of immigrants is not specific enough to understand whether it's, Southeast Asian immigrants, East Asian immigrants, whether it's immigrants from like Europe, from Latin America. We don't know because different immigrant diasporas experience wildly different experiences within the West, within various other countries in Europe, for example. So it's very unclear what that even means, what marginalization means. The second is that we don't know exactly what type of struggles people go through because, you're marginalized in different realms of society as well. So if you're talking about the relationship immigrants have to, for example, the healthcare system, maybe you want to expand on, for example, the idea that, the cultural imbalance between the doctor and the patient, meaning that you don't have proper lines of communication between them, means that immigrant families oftentimes feel like they're a wounded animal being treated by a veterinarian rather than an actual balanced relationship between a physician and a client. This means then that, very oftentimes doctors will omit certain information to them. This means that the treatment that they recommend and the treatment that immigrants oftentimes get, medically speaking, are things that they don't even know if it's good or not for them, and they're unable to make the decisions for themselves. That limits their autonomy to feel like they can have any control over their own bodies in terms of engaging within the healthcare system. That could be an example of how specifically an X group of people are marginalized in a very specific context. So making sure that you are able to characterize very specifically what people go through is also really important, not just for the axis of how true an argument is, but especially for the axis of how important an argument is. Because if you don't understand the specific struggles that people go through, it's very difficult for a judge to really understand or credit you for an argument that you make for being in terms of how relevant it is to the round. Because following the analysis that I gave you, contrasting that to just basically saying, immigrants are affected, or marginalized by the healthcare system, and contrast that to what I was saying, what I said immediately makes you significantly more relevant to the round, right? So that's an example of how nuancing is really important to prove something is important. Okay, sounds good. If you guys have any questions, just put them in the chat and I'll answer them. So this one I don't really care too much about, but I guess the analogy that I like to give to people is, think about nuancing like you're reading your favorite book, story, or movie or something like that. You probably have a favorite character, right? And you can think about who that favorite character is. Think about, why do you care about them? Is it because of their backstories, because of the way that the author characterizes their struggles and characterizes their personality? Why do you care about them? And that's exactly the same thing as debating, right? World building is the premise upon which we feel connection to any particular set of ideas, right? You don't really feel connected to characters that you feel are developed in really shallow ways. You don't really feel particularly connected to people or characters in books that you feel have underdeveloped backstories, for example. You're much more inclined or much more partial to really connect with characters that have a deep and rich backstory that you can relate to. So in the same way that arguments kind of exist, you want to be able to characterize a world that allows a judge to fully understand the relevance, the significance, and the trueness of the stakeholder or the argument that you're necessarily making. So that's kind of the analogy I like to draw between world building in stories and world building in debating. Okay, so let's take an example, right? This house supports the Lean In movement. The Lean In movement focuses the narrative of women's liberation around being able to work within existing power structures rather than taking them down. Okay, that's what the motion is. So then let's brainstorm, right? Let's say the opposition claim says this is bad for women because it treats them as the people responsible for ending sexism, right? It's basically saying that if you individualize, the narrative of women's liberation, you make it seem like it's women's responsibility to fight for their own liberation rather than our responsibility to do so. What do you think about this? Is this impact sufficient? If not, what can be done to expound on this? If yes, what makes this impact so relevant? So the way that you want to kind of go about this drill is, you don't have to give me a specific answer, but I want you guys to brainstorm a couple questions that you would ask yourself to help you come up with better arguments for this. So what's an example of a question that you could ask yourself to give yourself much needed context for the argument that you're making? So if you're debating that motion, and let's say you're in preparation time with your partner, right? What question would you ask them to help you guys brainstorm? Yeah.
You can ask something like, what does ending sexism mean? What are the power structures that have to change? What are the ways that narratives are currently propagated in media, and who would have to change their opinions on women to start getting better narratives?
Yeah, 100%, 100%. That's a really good one, or a really good series of questions. What else? What do you guys think? What other questions would you guys ask yourself to brainstorm?
Why might women be better at ending sexism than anyone else potentially? Why is that a bad thing? I guess that's an assumption.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. That's a good one as well. Anyone else? Okay, no worries. So I think we got some good questions from both of you guys. And I'll give you guys like a list of stuff that I thought of when I was like making the presentation. So here's some important questions that you could ask in the context of preparation for this round. Firstly, if we're considering stakeholders, like I said at the beginning of the round, which women would this harm the most, right? The second is, as a follow-up on this, is that are there women that it actually benefits? If so, why is that less important? Why is that more important? 3, why doesn't every woman feel the same way about the movement? Is it a problem that they don't feel the same way? 4, are there factors outside of their gender that inflect how they might feel like this? And how should we account for those factors in assessing the impact on women writ large? 5, what does placing responsibility for ending sexism actually look like? 6, does this harm occur purely on a narrative level, or does it have a practical standpoint? And how should we weigh up narratives versus practicalities when talking about feminism anyway? So when you're talking about practical endpoint, you can think about policy change and stuff like that. Whereas narrative is more of a societal narrative level about how people view certain issues, right? So how do we weigh those two things up if we think there's a distinction between those two? And the reason why these are important, and I want to point to a couple of these as an example, is because these are really crucial for characterizing what the feminist movement is like and where the interests of specific groups of women in society. So if you're talking about which one would this harm the most, you can maybe say by default, you can say stuff like how this harms, women of color, trans women, for example, maybe. Those are all examples of different subgroups under like the large umbrella term of women that you can probably talk about in this debate. Are there women that it benefits, right? And if so, why is that less important or more important? So you can maybe say that some women that potentially could benefit from this are very wealthy white women, for example, who have a lot of power in society. And you can maybe say that, maybe this is beneficial for them because they have the actual capacity to do things like, engage in the lean in narrative and actually manifest that for themselves. And you can talk about why that is less important when weighing against other groups of women. You can maybe ask yourself, why doesn't every woman feel the same way about the movement? Is there a problem that they don't feel the same way? Are there factors outside their gender? So socioeconomic class, women who are poor, women who are socioeconomically disadvantaged, your race, for example, women who like women of color, for example, how they might feel about this, immigrant women, how should we account for all of these different factors and interests in assessing the impact on women writ large? So if we're talking about focusing on specifically women who have been socioeconomically disenfranchised, you can maybe explain why that might be more important than focusing on women who already have a lot of like intergenerational wealth, for example, right? These are all examples of questions that you want to ask yourself that'll help you develop motions, develop arguments in a significantly more nuanced and specific way. Because now you can focus on specific groups of women, you can focus on specific ways that specific groups of women are harmed or benefited, right? So these are examples of how you want to add nuance to your arguments. So the way that you want to expand on this as like an activity, and like this is kind of like what I would do if you're like in preparation time, right? Is what I call the so what activity. And this is kind of akin to having like an annoying younger sibling, right? Or just like talking to any little kid where they'll be really fucking annoying. Every step of the way, like you try to tell them something, they're just like, so what? Or like, why? Or like, why? Or like, so what? Like over and over and over again, right? It's really, really annoying. But you want to be that annoying younger sibling to your partner, right? You want to make sure that you guys develop the best case possible. And this is actually really good for those purposes, right? Because, for example, let's say you want to talk about an argument like X policy will impact, immigrant families. So what? And then you can expand on that. And then you ask, so what again? And then you can expand on that. So that's kind of an activity that I want you guys to employ when you guys are doing your preparation. So let's think about how this applies, right? As an example. The coming out narrative describes stories where queer youth come out to their families and their parents accept their sexuality. This house opposes the centrality of the coming out narrative in queer media. So this is like a motion that we debated, like I debated like at some point last year at like Chances, I think. This is the argument that Vidit and I ran. Don't worry about this. I think it was the CO. We're on CO or something like that. Don't worry about the position. But let's say the claim that you want to make is that we support the coming out narrative because this combats heteronormativity, okay? Let's say that's the claim that you want to make. This is good because it combats heteronormativity. So let's say the argument then is that the coming out narrative in media is instrumental in moving queer ideas into the mainstream. because prior to this, the queer communities had to operate secretly without capacity to express themselves more openly. This type of depiction, therefore, helps bring these ideas into the mainstream because this narrative literally encourages people to tell people that you ought to be open and that it necessitates that more people know about this. But even if you don't meet that criteria, this is still good because it tells those who don't come out that these are the sets of expectations you should have of others when treating you. And that's kind of like tying into like our entire claim of combating heteronormativity. What do you guys think about this argument, guys? Is it a good argument, or do you think it has a lot to be improved on? Do you think it's sufficiently developed? You can do thumbs up for yes, thumbs down for no. Let's see the emojis, guys. Thumbs up for yes, thumbs down for no. Okay, so we got a no. How's everyone else? How does everyone else feel? We got a yes. Okay, so Jenny, I believe you said no. Why do you think this is insufficient as an argument?
I just don't think that there is any comparative. You just stated something that's generally good about how it combats heteronormativity without addressing any of the negative consequences that this narrative may bring.
Yeah, for sure. So obviously in the context of the round, you obviously have to weigh this on the comparative. But I want you guys to consider this in a vacuum, right? About combating heteronormativity. You know, especially if we're talking about specifically how we can expand on the importance of people's experiences and stuff like that. Why do you guys think this is insufficient? Because Jenny's correct in that, you know, obviously in the context of the round, this has to be more comparative. But if we're evaluating this in a vacuum, what do you guys think? In a vacuum, do you think this argument is good or bad? So let's assume that let's assume exclusivity. Let's assume that comparatively speaking, this argument weighs out the other side. All right, Jenny still says no. What do you think so?
I don't think there's enough mechanization for the impacts. It just says that this thing will happen. It will encourage more people, but we don't have a clear picture of what that looks like and how that will happen.
Yeah, for sure. 100%. And I want to go into more depth about how we can employ the so what activity to help us expand on those impacts so you have a better idea of the reasons for why certain impacts are likely to follow from this argument. Because you are right in that this argument is deeply insufficient in explaining the harms that government side might have on like queer people, as well as like what would happen if this narrative didn't exist. So why is less visibility in media harmful? And why is deprioritizing this narrative harmful? That is a question that I think we need to ask ourselves if we want to expand on the argument that we just kind of presented. So do you guys have any thoughts on this so far before I go into like the next slide? Why is less visibility in media harmful? And why is deprioritizing this narrative harmful? What is the harm of having less visibility in media? Who wants to take a crack at it?
You have less queer representation in mainstream culture.
Okay, so what?
I think generally that just makes it a lot harder for people to be openly queer because you don't have role models, you don't have people who are like you, so it's not a normal thing.
Okay, so what?
Then people feel really isolated, probably very ostracized, probably feel insecure about their identities, feel like they have to stay in the closet because they don't have anybody else like them. So it's really, really difficult for them to then come out and be openly queer.
Okay, and so what?
That's just very damaging for individuals.
Okay, for sure.
That's
for
really
sure.
bad.
No, I think you did good. I'm just being a dick. No, that was solid. And I think that's like kind of like aligns with most of the stuff that I have on the next slide as well. So if we're going to answer the question, why is less visibility in media harmful? We can go along a couple steps. And keep in mind, this is not nearly enough. I would personally expand on this a bit more if possible, but this is like the general idea of like what we want to talk about. So you can say, the reason why less visibility in media is harmful, or the reason why heteronormativity in media is harmful, is because queer people are more likely to grow up in a world where people assume that they're straight. Obviously, if your society, if your media, everything that reinforces heteronormativity kind of exists, obviously this is the world that is likely going to happen, right? So what, right? So what? That means that they have to fight for their sexuality to be acknowledged. They have to come out when their straight peers never will. they'll have fewer visible role models, have fewer support systems in place, because these factors mean that other queer people will also be less visible and therefore also less able to help them. So what? This all increases the sense of isolation that an already vulnerable group of people have to deal with, which has devastating impacts on their mental health and coping skills. And like you can go like down and down the rabbit hole, right? This is just an example of like a brief example of like the kinds of thought process that I want you guys to have when you're expanding on any given stakeholder in the round. Making sure you ask your partner and yourself, so what, at every step of the way, because even these claims, you can probably expand on them by at least 3-4 more lines, right? And that means that like your argument about this thing reinforces heteronormativity becomes significantly stronger as you ask yourself more questions to prod along why specifically this specific narrative is harmful or like, you know, beneficial to people, or why the absence of that they're like otherwise. So yeah, that's kind of the seminar. There's like more slides later, but like it's just more drills, honestly. If you guys like want to see that later, you guys can let me know. But yeah, that's like the whole idea. You want to make sure that you're going to add a lot of as much specificity as possible in your arguments. And I think that's the most important thing when you want to consider, you know, your characterization and your mechanization. Okay, sounds good. Does anyone have any questions?